The autumn wind howled through the narrow canyons of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains near Santa Fe, carrying with it the acrid smell of gun smoke that still clung to Running Cloud's buckskin shirt. The last surviving warrior of the Ghost Creek band of Comanche pressed himself against the cold rock face, his heart pounding as he listened for the sound of horses below. 3 days had passed since the massacre at the Lewis Silver Mine, where 12 miners lay dead, killed by arrows and tomahawks, while Running Cloud had been miles away, tracking a wounded elk for his dwindling band's winter stores. Matthew Harris, the newly appointed territorial marshal, studied the tracks leading away from the mine with narrowed eyes. His deputy, John Wright, stood nearby, nervously fingering the warrant in his pocket that promised $500 for the capture of the savage murderer. But Harris wasn't convinced. In 15 years of tracking outlaws across the frontier, he'd never seen a Comanche raid that left behind so much valuable equipment untouched. The killer had wanted it to look like Indians, but something wasn't adding up. The winter wind bit through Running Cloud's thin clothing as he made his way higher into the mountains, knowing the bounty hunters would have a harder time following his trail above the tree line. His mind wandered to the face of Grace Young, the kind-hearted daughter of the general store owner in Santa Fe, who had always treated him fairly when he came to trade. She had warned him 3 weeks ago about strange men asking questions about the Comanche in the area, but he had dismissed her concerns. Now his entire band was dead, all except him. In Santa Fe, David King sat in his plush office at the Territorial Bank, carefully arranging the papers on his mahogany desk. The Silver Mine massacre would serve his purposes perfectly. With the miners dead and blame placed on the Indians, no one would look too closely at the mine's books or question why the last shipment of silver never arrived at his bank. He smiled as he thought of the savage they were hunting. Soon, the last witness to his scheme would be eliminated, and his path to wealth would be secure. Marshal Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the whole situation. The arrows found at the scene were fletched with turkey feathers, a Cherokee style, not Comanche, and the track showed the killer had worn moccasins, but the stride length suggested someone much shorter than the tall warrior they were hunting. He had met Running Cloud several times during peace talks, and the man had always struck him as honorable. This butchery didn't fit his character. Victoria Lewis stood behind the counter of her father's assay office, watching the steady stream of miners bringing in their daily finds. Her father, Michael Lewis, had owned the mine where the massacre occurred, and she couldn't help but notice how quickly David King had moved to foreclose on the property after her father's death. She had seen King meeting with a rough-looking stranger the day before the killings, a man wearing an oddly new-looking buckskin shirt with elaborate beadwork that no real Indian would waste time creating. Running Cloud found shelter in a shallow cave as darkness fell, gathering dry pine needles for a bed. He knew he couldn't risk a fire, not with at least 3 groups of bounty hunters on his trail. As he huddled against the cold, his thoughts turned to the strange tracks he had found near his band's winter camp 2 days before the massacre. Boots trying to imitate moccasin prints, but the pattern was wrong. Someone had wanted them to think Indians were prowling near the camp, but he knew better. The next morning, Marshal Harris rode into Santa Fe, his mind troubled. He had known Michael Lewis for years. They had served together in the war. The mine owner had mentioned problems with his bank loans just weeks before his death, hinting that King was pressuring him to sell. Now Lewis was dead, his mine foreclosed, and a convenient Indian massacre had covered up any evidence that might have suggested another explanation. Harris tied his horse outside the marshal's office, determined to dig deeper into the connection. Rebecca Wright, the schoolteacher, watched from her classroom window as another group of armed men rode into town, no doubt drawn by the bounty. She had taught Running Cloud's young sister to read during the brief period of peace 2 years ago, before the girl died of fever. The warrior had shown nothing but gratitude, bringing her fresh game and herbs throughout the winter that followed. The brutal slaughter at the mine didn't match the gentle man she had known. In the growing darkness, Andrew Young stocked the shelves of his general store, his daughter Grace helping with the inventory. They both looked up as the bell above the door chimed, admitting a rain-soaked stranger in expensive clothes. The man introduced himself as Hannah King, David's wife, claiming she was looking for supplies for her husband's upcoming hunting trip. But Grace noticed how the woman's eyes kept darting to the back room, where they sometimes allowed friendly Indians to sleep during trades. The stranger's tension was palpable, her fingers drumming nervously on the counter. Grace caught her father's subtle nod and casually moved toward the store's side entrance, slipping out into the rain-slicked alley. She knew the protocol. Whenever someone suspicious arrived asking veiled questions about their Indian friends, she was to alert Matthew at the livery stable. The young deputy had been Running Cloud's only ally among the lawmen, having witnessed the real perpetrator fleeing the mine massacre, but finding his testimony ignored by the corrupt sheriff. The rain had intensified, drumming against the weathered boardwalks of Virginia City as Grace hurried through puddles reflecting the dim glow of oil lamps. The mining town's streets were unusually quiet, most residents having sought shelter from the storm. In the distance, she could make out the silhouette of the ore processing mill against flashes of lightning, its massive wheels temporarily stilled by the deluge. Inside the store, Andrew maintained a carefully pleasant demeanor as he wrapped Hannah's purchases: rope, ammunition, and dried beef. He noticed how she positioned herself to keep the backroom door in view, her supposed shopping list forgotten as she pressed for information about recent Indian sightings. The storekeeper had survived 20 years on the frontier by reading people well, and this woman's practiced grace couldn't quite mask the predatory alertness of a hunter. At the livery stable, Matthew was already mounting up when Grace arrived, having spotted the strange woman's arrival from his vantage point. "Third bounty hunter this week," he muttered, checking his rifle. "They're getting desperate." That reward money would buy a lot of claims in the new Silver Strike. He had been gathering evidence against David King, the businessman funding the manhunt, suspecting him of orchestrating the mine attack to drive off the Comanche from mineral-rich tribal lands. The storm's fury increased as Matthew rode out, following the hidden trail that led to Running Cloud's cave in the high country. The warrior had saved his life during a mountain lion attack the previous summer, and the deputy knew the debt must be repaid. The real killer was still out there, growing bolder with each crime blamed on the Comanche. Just yesterday, a stage had been robbed by a painted savage who spoke perfect English and rode a thoroughbred horse. Back in the store, Hannah's questioning grew more direct as thunder rattled the windows. She produced a worn wanted poster, pointing to the crude sketch of Running Cloud. "My husband says this Indian's been raiding all through the territory. Surely you've seen something?" Her hand strayed to the pearl-handled revolver, partially concealed by her rain cape. Andrew carefully shifted to block her view of Grace's empty workstation, buying time for his daughter's warning to reach Matthew. In the caves above town, Running Cloud tended his small fire, using smoke from certain herbs to mask its presence from searching eyes. The warrior had learned much about the white man's ways during the peace, including how to read the newspapers that now branded him a murderer. He studied the latest edition by firelight, noting reports of attacks that followed a pattern, all near mining operations, all blamed on Indians, all benefiting the same wealthy investors. Victoria, the widow who ran the assay office, had been gathering proof of claim, jumping and claim fraud that preceded each raid. She had sent word through Matthew that ledgers showed David King's mining company filing papers on massacre sites mere days after each attack. But someone had learned of her investigation. That morning, she had found her office ransacked and her documents missing. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of greed and betrayal that stretched from Virginia City to Santa Fe. Running Cloud knew that survival alone was not enough. He had to clear his name and expose the truth. But with more bounty hunters arriving daily and winter approaching in the high country, time was running out. He could hear thunder echoing through the canyons, nature itself seeming to mirror the gathering storm of violence that threatened to break over the territory. Through the jagged peaks surrounding Virginia City, Shadow Walker moved like a ghost in the pre-dawn light. The last of the Mountain Crow band of Comanche, he carried the weight of his people's legacy even as he fled from those who would hang him for murders he didn't commit. The distinctive tracks he followed told him what he already suspected. The killer was no Indian at all, but a white man playing a deadly game of deception. Smoke rose from the mining camp ahead, where crews of men labored to extract silver from the mountain's stubborn grip. Shadow Walker had learned that the murderer, who called himself John Harris, had taken work at the Lewis Brothers mine while orchestrating his brutal charade. The outlaw's method was clever: commit robberies and killings while disguised as a Comanche warrior, letting the blame fall on the few remaining natives in the territory. In the camp's crude office, Matthew Lewis studied wanted posters with his brother David, neither aware of how close their quarry had come. The reward for Shadow Walker's capture stood at $500, dead or alive. "Another attack last night," Matthew said grimly. Trading post 10 miles south. 2 dead, same arrow markings as the others. David nodded, fingers drumming anxiously on his pistol grip. Among the miners emerging for their morning shift was John Harris himself, a lean man with cold eyes who'd appeared in Virginia City 3 months prior. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence, though he maintained a careful facade of simple mine work. Shadow Walker observed him from concealment, noting how the man's practiced limp vanished when he thought no one was watching. Victoria Wright, whose father Michael owned the assay office, had been watching Harris as well. Something about his story didn't sit right with her. The way he seemed to know too much about Indian ways, how he always had money despite his meager wages. Following them, he discovered something that confirmed his suspicions. Hidden in the mine's dark recesses was a bundle containing face paint, feathers, and a quiver of arrows matching those used in the murders. But before he could gather this evidence, voices echoed from the tunnel mouth. John Harris and Deputy King entered the shaft, speaking in hushed tones. The next raid happens tonight, Harris was saying. Trading post at the south end of town. Make sure your men are looking north like we discussed. Shadow Walker's blood ran cold as he realized the depth of the corruption. The law itself was complicit in the deception targeting his people. Victoria had followed the men, her own suspicions driving her to risk discovery. When she saw Shadow Walker in the shadows, her first instinct was to cry out. But something in his eyes made her pause. This was not the savage killer described in wanted posters. Before either could speak, Harris and King began moving deeper into the mine, forcing them to retreat in opposite directions. Throughout the day, Shadow Walker watched the camp while Victoria gathered information. She learned that Rebecca Harris, who claimed to be John's wife, was actually being held against her will, insurance against her, testifying about his true identity. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a conspiracy that went beyond simple murder and robbery. Grace Young, the telegraph operator, became an unwitting ally when Shadow Walker intercepted a message she was sending to Santa Fe. It contained details of the planned raid, but with deliberate misinformation about the target location. This confirmed that multiple officials were involved in the plot, using Indian attacks as cover for their own criminal enterprise. As evening approached, Shadow Walker faced a choice. He could flee north toward Amarillo, where some of his people had found refuge, or stay and risk everything to expose the truth. The sound of horses approaching made the decision for him. Hannah Lewis, Matthew's wife, was riding hard for the mine office, clutching a blood-stained letter that would change everything. The document Hannah carried was a confession from a dying man in Laredo, a former partner of Harris who detailed how they had engineered the false Indian raids across 3 territories. But Harris had spotted her arrival from his vantage point above the camp. As shadows lengthened across the valley, the night's true battle was about to begin. Not between Indians and settlers, but between justice and corruption that wore many faces. Shadow Walker moved silently through the deepening twilight, his moccasins finding purchase on the rocky ground as he made his way toward Hannah. The confession she carried could vindicate him, but Harris's men were already moving to intercept her. From his concealed position behind a cluster of scrub oak, he could see 3 riders emerging from the mine office, their intentions clear in the way they fanned out to cut off her approach. Hannah spurred her horse harder, the animal's hooves throwing sparks against stone as she navigated the treacherous mountain path. She hadn't seen the danger yet, focused only on reaching the safety of the main camp where witnesses might protect her. The leather satchel containing the confession was clutched tightly against her side, each thundering hoofbeat bringing her closer to either salvation or disaster. The dying light painted the valley in shades of purple and gold, casting long shadows that seemed to reach like grasping fingers across the rocky terrain. Mining equipment stood silent and skeletal against the darkening sky, while the scattered lights of Virginia City twinkled in the distance like fallen stars. Shadow Walker knew the territory well, every ridge and gully, every abandoned shaft and hidden trail, but so did Harris's men. A shot rang out, the sharp crack echoing off the canyon walls. Hannah's horse reared, nearly unseating her, but she managed to wheel the animal around and urge it toward a narrow gap between 2 massive boulders. Shadow Walker recognized her strategy. That passage led to a series of switchbacks that would be difficult for pursuers to navigate in the growing darkness, but Harris would have men waiting at the bottom. Drawing his knife, Shadow Walker moved parallel to Hannah's route, using the deepening shadows and his intimate knowledge of the terrain to remain unseen. He needed to reach the bottom of the switchbacks before she did, but the going was treacherous. One misplaced step on the loose shale could send him plummeting to his death or alert Harris's men to his presence. Above him, the sounds of pursuit grew more intense, shouts and gunfire mixing with the thunder of hooves on stone. Hannah was holding her own, but she couldn't keep up this pace forever. The confession she carried was too important to risk losing. It wasn't just Shadow Walker's freedom at stake, but justice for dozens of innocent people who had died in the false raids orchestrated by Harris and his conspirators. The air grew colder as night settled fully over the mountains. Shadow Walker could hear water rushing in the creek below, swollen with spring runoff. He reached the bottom of the switchbacks, just as Hannah's horse appeared on the trail above, its sides heaving with exertion. 3 riders were still in pursuit, but they were being more cautious now, aware of the treacherous terrain. What Harris's men didn't know was that Shadow Walker had spent weeks studying their operations, learning their patterns and weaknesses. He had watched as they used Comanche disguises to raid settlements, carefully crafting a narrative that would direct blame away from their own criminal enterprise. The confession Hannah carried would expose it all: the corruption, the murders, the theft of both Indian and settler lives for profit. Moving quickly, Shadow Walker positioned himself near a narrow point in the trail where the pursuers would have to ride single file. The creek roared below, its waters black in the darkness. He could hear Hannah's approach, her horse's labored breathing, and the scatter of loose stones beneath its hooves. The moment was coming, and everything would depend on perfect timing and the element of surprise. The first rider appeared, rifle raised and scanning the shadows. Shadow Walker remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the man passed his position. The second rider followed, and then the third. Only when they were fully committed to the narrow passage did Shadow Walker make his move, emerging from concealment like a spirit of vengeance. The ensuing chaos would echo through the canyons for years to come. The chaos erupted like thunder in the narrow pass. Shadow Walker's war cry split the night as he launched himself from his position, catching the middle rider with a swift tackle that sent them both tumbling. The other 2 bounty hunters wheeled their horses in confusion, their mounts nearly colliding in the confined space as they struggled to bring their weapons to bear in the darkness. Hannah seized the moment of confusion, urging her horse forward through the gap while the hunters were distracted. The precious documents tucked safely in her saddlebag held the truth about Marshal Andrews' corrupt operation. How he'd orchestrated the false flag attacks on settlements while disguised as Comanche warriors, all to justify seizing more tribal lands for his mining interests. Shadow Walker rolled with his opponent down the steep embankment, grabbing for the man's rifle as they tumbled through the scrub brush. Above them, shots rang out as the other hunters fired blindly into the darkness. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, creating a disorienting cacophony that worked to Shadow Walker's advantage. He could move in this darkness like a fish through water, while these men were as clumsy as blind buffalo. The hunter he'd tackled, a man he recognized as Matthew, one of Andrews' most brutal deputies, managed to keep hold of his rifle but couldn't bring it to bear at such close quarters. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the jagged peaks surrounding Virginia City as Running Cloud crouched behind a massive boulder, his heart pounding. The bounty hunter's horses kicked up clouds of dust on the narrow mountain trail below. He recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Michael Harris, whose silver badge glinted mockingly in the dying light. For 3 weeks, the lawman had pursued him relentlessly, claiming Running Cloud had murdered 2 miners at the King's silver mine. But the Comanche warrior knew the truth. He had witnessed the real killer, a white man in stolen tribal dress, fleeing the scene that bloody night. Through his eagle-sharp vision, Running Cloud counted 6 riders total, including Andrew Young, the ruthless bounty hunter known for bringing in his quarry dead more often than alive. The warrior's fingers tightened around his Winchester rifle as he watched Young gesture toward the rocky slopes. The group split up, 3 riders heading higher into the crags, while the others continued along the main trail. They were trying to box him in against the sheer cliff faces ahead. Inside an abandoned mining shack half a mile away, Rebecca Lewis huddled near a shuttered window, gripping her father's old Colt revolver. As the mine owner's daughter, she had grown up in these mountains, exploring every cave and crevice. When she found the wounded Comanche warrior 2 days ago, something in his eyes had convinced her of his innocence. Now she was harboring him, risking everything to help expose the truth about the murders that had terrorized the mining camp. The real killer had left a telling clue, a distinctive brass button torn from his shirt during the struggle, engraved with the insignia of the Virginia City Marshal's office. Running Cloud had shown it to Rebecca, and her blood ran cold when she recognized it. Marshal John Wright had been leading the investigation, making a show of protecting the miners while secretly orchestrating a campaign of violence designed to drive them away from their claims. The murders were just his latest attempt to seize control of the richest silver deposits. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon as one of the bounty hunters fired at a movement in the shadows. Running Cloud held perfectly still, knowing they were shooting at nothing more than a startled deer. But the sound had given him an idea. Reaching into his medicine pouch, he withdrew a small leather bag of black powder he had salvaged from an abandoned mine shaft. If he could create enough of a distraction, he might be able to circle behind his pursuers and make it to the marshal's office where he knew the evidence of Wright's corruption was hidden. Rebecca jumped at the sound of boots on the cabin's wooden porch. She raised the Colt with trembling hands as the door slowly creaked open. But it was only David Lewis, her older brother who served as deputy marshal. His face was grave as he holstered his gun. "The whole town's talking about you helping the Indian," he said quietly. "Wright's offering a reward for information. You need to be careful, sister." Rebecca met his concerned gaze. "David, Wright is behind everything. We have proof." She told him about the button, watching his expression shift from doubt to dark understanding. Running Cloud moved like a shadow through the deepening dusk, using every scrap of cover the rocky terrain provided. The bounty hunters' horses were hobbled in a small box canyon, their riders now hunting on foot. He could hear their voices carrying on the wind as they called to each other, coordinating their search. Young's distinctive laugh sent a chill down his spine. The man was enjoying the hunt far too much. But Running Cloud had learned patience from his grandfather, the great medicine man. He would wait for the perfect moment to spring his trap. The explosion when it came was deafening, the black powder charge transforming a shallow mine shaft into a roaring dragon's mouth of flame and smoke. Running Cloud was already moving as the bounty hunters rushed toward the blast, their shouts of alarm echoing off the canyon walls. He slipped past them like a ghost, making his way swiftly down the mountain toward town. But he wasn't heading for the marshal's office anymore. Rebecca had told him about the real proof, hidden in Wright's private study at his home on the outskirts of Virginia City. Marshal Wright sat at his desk, penning a letter to the territorial governor requesting more men and resources to deal with the Indian raids he had fabricated. A knock at the door made him look up sharply. "Enter," he called, relaxing slightly when he saw it was only Deputy Lewis. But something was different about the young lawman's stance as he stepped inside. "Sir, we need to talk about the murders at King's Silver Mine," David said quietly, his hand resting near his holster. Wright's eyes narrowed as he noticed the shadows moving beyond his window. The final confrontation exploded in a fury of gunfire and shattering glass. Running Cloud burst through the window while Rebecca and David crashed through the door, their weapons trained on the corrupt marshal. Wright went for his gun, but Running Cloud was faster, knocking the weapon away with a powerful strike. "It's over," David announced grimly, producing the evidence they had found in Wright's study. Letters proving he had been working with mining companies to drive out independent prospectors, along with a bloody shirt that matched the button found at the murder scene. Wright's face contorted with rage as his carefully constructed facade crumbled. The dying sunlight filtering through the shattered window cast long shadows across the office, highlighting the tension etched on every face. "You don't understand what's really happening in Virginia City," he snarled, his back pressed against his desk. "These mining companies bring progress, civilization. The old ways have to die." Running Cloud stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the corrupt marshal. "The old ways taught honor," he replied quietly. "Something you abandoned when you murdered those miners and tried to blame my people." The Comanche warrior's calm demeanor seemed to unnerve Wright more than any show of anger could have. Behind them, Rebecca kept her rifle steady, while David moved to secure the fallen pistol. Through the broken window came the sounds of gathering townspeople, drawn by the commotion. The truth would spread quickly now, as it always did in mining towns. Wright's carefully cultivated reputation as the stalwart defender of law and order would soon be replaced by his true nature, a killer who had used his badge to serve the mining company's interests while destroying innocent lives. The Silverton Mining Company paid you well, didn't they? David's voice carried bitter disappointment. He had once looked up to Wright as a mentor, making the betrayal cut deeper. We found the bank drafts in your study. $5,000 for every independent claim you helped them seize. He pulled out a leather folio filled with damning documents, each one another nail in Wright's coffin. Rebecca moved closer, her rifle never wavering. Those families you drove off their claims, the ones who disappeared on the trail to Santa Fe, they weren't killed by Comanches, were they? It was you, wearing war paint and feathers, making sure everyone blamed the tribes. Her words carried the weight of personal loss. Her own father had been one of the disappeared prospectors. Wright's composure finally shattered. With a roar of desperate fury, he lunged forward, reaching for a hidden derringer in his desk drawer. Running Cloud moved like lightning, his hand catching Wright's wrist in an iron grip. The two men struggled, crashing against the wall as the small gun clattered to the floor. David rushed forward to help, but Running Cloud had already subdued the marshal, forcing him face down onto the rough wooden planks. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, their angry murmurs rising like thunder. Justice in mining towns could be swift and brutal, especially when trusted authority figures betrayed their oaths. David quickly secured Wright in manacles, knowing they needed to get him to the jail before mob justice took over. The territorial judge will be here in 3 days, he announced. He'll stand trial for everything he's done. Running Cloud watched as they led Wright away, his expression unreadable. Rebecca approached him, holding out a folded piece of paper. "This is a written statement clearing you and your people of any wrongdoing," she said softly. "It's signed by every surviving witness who saw Wright's true actions. You're free now." The warrior took the document carefully, knowing it represented more than just his own vindication. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of blood and gold as people began to disperse. Some headed to the saloon to spread the news, others to send telegrams to neighboring towns. The truth would ride the wire to Laredo and Amarillo by morning, unraveling Wright's web of lies wherever it had spread. But for Running Cloud, the victory felt hollow. It couldn't bring back those who had died or heal the wounds of suspicion between his people and the settlers. David emerged from the jail, looking weary but determined. "We'll need your testimony at the trial," he said to Running Cloud. "Will you stay?" The question carried deeper meaning, a chance for understanding between two worlds that had too often clashed in bloodshed. Running Cloud studied the young deputy's honest face, seeing a future where justice might truly be blind to the color of a man's skin. The last rays of daylight faded from the mountaintops as Running Cloud made his decision. The path ahead would not be easy, but perhaps this moment could be a beginning rather than an end. Sometimes the hardest battles were fought not with weapons but with truth and the courage to stand for it. In the gathering dusk, 3 unlikely allies, a Comanche warrior, a frontier deputy, and a determined woman, stood together, their shadows merging into one as night claimed the land. The sun rose blood-red over Virginia City's scattered mines as Running Cloud crouched behind an abandoned ore cart, his breath misting in the crisp mountain air. Below him, Sheriff Michael Wright conferred with bounty hunter John Harris near the assay office, their voices carrying on the wind. Through weeks of pursuit, Running Cloud had pieced together the truth. The real killer was David Lewis, a disgraced former deputy who'd been staging raids in Comanche dress to cover his robberies of the silver shipments. Nearby, Rebecca Young, the assayer's daughter who had helped Running Cloud evade capture, watched from the window of her father's office. She had recognized Lewis's distinctive limp in the Indian raids described by witnesses, the same limp he'd acquired years ago in a mining accident. But Lewis had friends in high places, including Andrew King, the corrupt territorial marshal who had helped cover up the deputy's crimes while collecting a share of the stolen silver. Running Cloud's hand brushed the pouch at his belt, containing proof of the conspiracy. Letters between Lewis and King detailing their scheme, recovered from Lewis's hideout in an abandoned mine shaft. The warrior had found them while tracking Lewis's trail, along with strips of dark paint and feathers used to craft his tribal disguise. But bringing the truth to light would mean facing down not just Lewis, but the marshal's entire corrupt operation. Rebecca had already paid a price for helping him. King's men had ransacked her father's office, claiming to search for evidence of Running Cloud's presence but really seeking to intimidate them into silence. The young woman's courage in continuing to aid him, despite the danger, had touched something in the Running Cloud's battle-hardened heart. He could not let harm come to her or her father. In the street below, Lewis himself appeared, speaking urgently with Wright and Harris. Running Cloud's keen eyes noted how the former deputy's hand kept straying to his gun belt, his manner growing more agitated as Wright examined the wanted posters. The warrior knew Lewis feared exposure. Several witnesses had begun questioning the official story about Indian raiders, after Rebecca started quietly spreading doubts. Victoria Harris, the bounty hunter's wife who ran the local boarding house, emerged from her establishment with a loaded rifle. She had lost her brother in one of Lewis's false raids and had been among the loudest voices calling for Running Cloud's capture. But Rebecca had recently shown her evidence suggesting Lewis's involvement. And now, the woman's hard expression held a hint of uncertainty as she watched the men confer. Time was running short. Marshal King would arrive on tomorrow's stage from Santa Fe, supposedly to oversee Running Cloud's capture, but really to ensure loose ends were tied up. The warrior knew King would not hesitate to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth, including Rebecca and her father. He had to act before more innocent blood was shed. With silent grace, Running Cloud began working his way down the rocky slope behind the mines. Rebecca had arranged for him to meet with Grace Wright, the sheriff's wife, who had her own suspicions about Lewis after discovering mysterious late-night meetings between him and her husband. If he could convince her to help expose the conspiracy, her testimony could sway the sheriff. The meeting was set for noon at the abandoned Lucky Strike mine, chosen for its multiple escape routes through the honeycomb of old tunnels. But as Running Cloud approached, he caught the glint of sunlight on gun barrels. Lewis's men were already there, lying in wait. The trap had been sprung too soon. He would have to find another way to reveal the truth before King arrived to bury it forever. Hannah Lewis, David's estranged wife who worked as a seamstress in town, had been watching her husband's increasingly erratic behavior with growing alarm. When Rebecca approached her with evidence of his crimes, Hannah had recognized items of clothing she'd mended, garments that had later been described by witnesses to the Indian raids. Her conscience would not let her remain silent while an innocent man was hunted. As Running Cloud carefully backtracked from the ambush site, he heard horses approaching from the direction of town. Through his spyglass, he saw Hannah and Rebecca riding hard along the mountain trail, pursued by several of King's deputies. The women had clearly decided to act on their own, perhaps trying to reach the territorial governor with their evidence before King arrived. The warrior knew he could escape into the mountains, leave these white people to their own justice. But Rebecca had risked everything to help prove his innocence, and Hannah had found the courage to stand against her own husband's crimes. He could not abandon them now. With grim determination, Running Cloud began planning how to help the women escape while using the chaos to expose the true criminals once and for all. The final confrontation unfolded like a gathering storm. Running Cloud led King's deputies on a chase through the mine tunnels, while Rebecca and Hannah made for the telegraph office with their evidence. Lewis, panicked by his unraveling scheme, attempted to silence the women himself but was stopped by Victoria Harris's well-aimed rifle. The bounty hunter's wife had chosen justice over vengeance. Sheriff Wright, forced to face the truth about his own role in the corruption, finally took a stand against Marshal King when the territorial official arrived. Backed into a corner, King attempted to shoot his way free, but fell to Running Cloud's arrow, a fitting end for a man who had built his criminal empire on false accusations against the Comanche. In the aftermath, Running Cloud was cleared of all charges. Though he could never reclaim his lost tribal lands, he found a new kind of belonging in the friendship of those who had helped expose the truth. Rebecca's father offered him work as a mine security consultant, while Hannah and Victoria worked to change attitudes toward the remaining native peoples in the territory. Sometimes justice comes not from the law, but from the courage of those who stand against corruption, regardless of the cost. In the months that followed Marshal King's downfall, Virginia City underwent a transformation. The corrupt officials who had enabled his schemes were removed one by one, replaced by men and women, chosen for their integrity rather than their willingness to look the other way. Running Cloud found an unexpected role as a bridge between two worlds, his knowledge of both tribal ways and mining operations proving invaluable as the territory struggled to build a more just future. The mine, under Rebecca's father's enlightened management and Running Cloud's guidance, became a model of fair labor practices. Native workers were hired alongside white miners. Their traditional knowledge of the mountain's pathways and water sources helping to make the operation both safer and more profitable. The old prejudices didn't disappear overnight, but change came steadily, one small victory at a time. Victoria Harris transformed her ranch into a sanctuary of sorts, offering shelter to those who needed time to rebuild their lives after King's reign of terror. Hannah joined her there, using her healing skills to tend to both body and spirit. The two women formed a formidable partnership, their different backgrounds complementing each other in ways that strengthened their shared mission of reconciliation. The truth about the false accusations against the Comanche spread throughout the territory, carried by newspaper articles and word of mouth. Sheriff Wright, seeking to make amends for his past blindness, traveled to Santa Fe to testify before the territorial governor. His detailed account of King's manipulation of law enforcement led to a broader investigation of similar cases across the frontier. Running Cloud often rode the mountain trails alone, visiting the sacred places of his ancestors. Though he was the last of his band, he found that memory could be a form of survival. He documented the old stories, working with Hannah to preserve them in writing for future generations. The painful past couldn't be changed, but its lessons could light the way forward. The bounty hunters who had once pursued Running Cloud became some of his strongest allies. Their knowledge of the territory's hidden paths proved useful in tracking down the remaining members of King's network. Together, they created a new kind of justice, one that relied on understanding rather than force, on truth rather than prejudice. Rebecca's mining company established a school near Virginia City, where both native and white children studied together. Running Cloud sometimes taught there, sharing stories of the land's history that had never before been heard in a classroom. The children's natural curiosity and openness to each other gave hope for a future different from the past. As winter settled over the mountains, bringing snow to the high passes, Running Cloud found himself spending more time in Virginia City than he had ever expected. The town was changing, growing into something new. The old saloon where King had once held court was now a meeting hall where citizens of all backgrounds gathered to discuss the territory's future. The discovery of King's detailed records revealed the full extent of his crimes, including evidence that cleared several other native bands of wrongdoing. Running Cloud worked tirelessly to ensure this information reached the proper authorities, even writing to Laredo himself to present the documents to a federal judge who had shown fairness in similar cases. Victoria's ranch became a stopping point for traders and travelers, a place where stories were shared and understanding grew. She and Hannah hosted regular gatherings where different cultures met in peace, sharing meals and music under the vast western sky. These simple moments did more to heal old wounds than any official proclamation could have achieved. The mountains themselves seemed to approve of these changes, offering up rich new veins of ore just when the old mines had begun to falter. Running Cloud's knowledge of the terrain, combined with modern mining techniques, led to discoveries that ensured the town's prosperity without destroying the land's sacred places. As spring approached, bringing new growth to the mountain meadows, Running Cloud stood at the grave of his family members, now properly marked and honored. He was no longer alone in his grief or his hope. The territory was changing, slowly but surely, into a place where truth mattered more than prejudice, where justice meant more than revenge. The story of the Comanche warrior who had been hunted became part of the territory's legend, but not in the way Marshal King had intended. Instead of a tale of fear and hatred, it became a story of transformation, of how the courage to face truth could change not just one life but an entire community. The mountain passes that had once echoed with pursuit now rang with the sounds of cooperation and growth.